All right, everyone. It's good to be here this morning. I'm Jeff Henriod from AWS Startups. Thrilled for our session today, which is Starting Up Security Tips with Christina Cacioppo, who is the co-founder and CEO of Vanta. And we'll have more to introduce Christina in a moment. We're also joined by Faisal. He is an AWS solutions architect specialized in security. So he's here to help answer questions as well, especially for anything that's AWS specific. All right. So I just want to give a couple, I will do some brief housekeeping before I turn the time over to Christina. So first off, just a reminder of the lineup for this CTO fellowship series. This is our third session. Next week is the final session. So next week is Choosing the Right Architecture with Jillian Ford. She's going to talk about common startup architectures, how to choose the right database, just different ways that we see startups approaching it, what's most common, and some different best practices. We will also have an AMA, a similar asynchronous AMA to what we did 2 weeks ago after that session. So you'll have 2 days to submit as many questions as you would like. And our solution architects will then spend the week after the 7th responding to those questions in writing. Few housekeeping things. So first off, as soon as I'm done talking, I will re-drop the Slido link. Please submit your questions to Slido and not to the Zoom Q&A or the Zoom chat. If you submit your questions in Zoom chat or Zoom Q&A, I'm gonna push you directly to Slido. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of all of the questions. There's also better upvoting functionality. So use Slido. Second, as always, I will share a feedback survey and the recording within 24 hours of the event. I already mentioned the asynchronous AMA that we'll launch next week. If you have any questions related to the fellowship at all, send me an email and I'll respond within 24 hours. Just a reminder for getting the credits, you need to attend at least 2 of these workshops. You need to complete the end of series feedback survey, which we will share after next week's session. And unfortunately, if you've already received AWS Activate credits of up to $5,000, you won't be eligible. So with that out of the way, first off, just to introduce Christina, we're very lucky to have her. So Vanta basically pioneered the automated security space. They've already run SOC 2 compliance for almost 2,000 companies. They've basically automated SOC 2. They recently raised a Series A from Sequoia, as well as Y Combinator. So backed by top investors, one of the more exciting B2B startups out there. We're very fortunate to have her. And with that, I will turn it over to Christina and she can maybe give a little bit more on her background and jump into the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me. Excited to talk with you all today. I'll start with like a brief intro, and then I have a set of slides I'll walk through. And would love questions along the way in Slido. I don't think I'm talented enough to answer them as I'm going in Slido, but if you could put them in there, and then we'll just blitz through as many as possible at the end, would be great. So for a little bit of agenda setting there. So a little bit of background about me, as Jeff mentioned, co-founder and CEO of Vanta. We've been around for about 3.5-4-ish years. And the whole idea is help startups like you all start security well from the start, kind of implement some easy best practices, build with security in mind, and then over time be able to prove that you are more secure through one of these compliance certifications, SOC 2, HIPAA, ISO, like the whole alphabet soup of things there. And so we help startups, again, get secure and then prove that through these audits and go through these quickly. Prior to working on Vanta, as a product manager at Dropbox, I worked on Dropbox Paper, sort of Dropbox's version of Google Docs. And that's where a little bit of the origin of Vanta came. The short story is we were all ready to take paper to market, give it to all the Dropbox customers. Basically, we were going to take over the world. And we realized we couldn't because we hadn't met Dropbox's security requirements. We didn't have a SOC 2. We had to stop everything. And it was either stop everything for a year and go get all that stuff, or don't, but then go find your own customers independent of Dropbox. We took route 2. It was unclear what route we should have taken, but it was also just kind of backing up a step a little questionable, where Dropbox had bought this startup. They were going to add the product to their whole suite, and then it was like, oh wait, no, you can't because of all of these security and compliance obligations. That honestly made a lot of sense, but was just very much complicated, the go-to-market. So that was a bit of the origin of Vanta. Prior to that, I spent about 2 years learning to code and building a bunch of stuff you have never ever heard of or seen or kind of no one used. So it was a good crash course in product building and not making things people wanted, and trying to learn how to do that better in the future. And then I actually started my career in early stage venture at Union Square Ventures in New York. So from in New York that did kind of seed Series A investments at the time, mostly in consumer, because that's the companies folks were starting. And so not at all part of the agenda, but if you have kind of financing questions, I'm very much glad I am not a VC and not in that world. I like being like a startup founder and operator infinitely more, but I actually kind of still like talking about VC. So if you have questions there, I think I can be helpful. Please don't hesitate to reach out. So it's a little bit about me. Now I'm going to share my screen and can go through some of the more security focused tips. And this is really just based a bit more of an intro. So we're going to go through like 9 tips for kind of starting up security, right? Like as you're starting to build your company and build your product. And I'm kind of going to make the assumption y'all don't have, a ton of customers right now. And so you're probably trying to trade off, hey, I know I should be secure and be reasonable and do the right things, but also like I'm trying to find product market fit, right? I don't want to slow down my iteration speed. I want to build things customers want, or I want to test these ideas. And so how do I balance these competing objectives? So that's sort of the frame here. Cool. Okay. So with that, introduce myself, know who I am. And here are the 9 tips we're going to go through, and we'll go through these one by one. So don't worry about trying to get them all now. But again, this is what we'll just kind of walk through and talk through over the next probably half hour or so. Cool. Okay, so the first one, you know more than you think. Okay, so this, and I'll weave in a little bit of Vanta's origin story here, but I sort of mentioned, right, when we were vetting the idea for Vanta, we went around to a lot of startup founders, friends, CEOs, CTOs, and asked them how they thought about security at their company. And far and away, the most common answer we got was, I just worry about it, right? Like I know enough to know that I should be worried and something bad could happen, but I sort of don't know what to do or how to start. And that was kind of the most common answer. The second answer was, I actually have this idea of where I should start. I have this list of things I want to do in order to better, secure my cloud infrastructure, secure my company, secure my employees, customer data. But I'm not prioritizing any of it because, again, I'm trying to get early customers. I'm trying to find product market fit. So mostly I just stay up at night worrying. And so actually, from our validation perspective, we heard that. We're like, oh, wait, hey, there's an opportunity here to demystify this. But then from your all's perspective, one thing I kind of want to leave you with is this idea that you do know more than you think. And by that, I mean the solid engineering practices that you've learned in school or through side projects or prior companies actually get you pretty far when you think about compliance and to some amount of security. And so I would just encourage you when you kind of have these questions of like, should I do X or Y, or how should I set this up? Rather than thinking about it as like, oh, I don't know what the security answer is. I either need to go figure that out, or like, I'll just never, I don't have time for this. You can instead kind of switch your mindset into one where it's, hey, what's the solid engineering practice one, right? Like I've been reading Hacker News for a while, like what would the Hacker News blog post say I should do here? And that is like probably a quite reasonable answer for this. So again, just wanted to start with this because security can seem like such a frightening, or like in group, you have to know all the special things and special people sort of thing. Starting with this idea that you all know more than you think, relying on best practices, relying on, again, just the engineering that you've done over the past years, decades, whatever, can be really helpful. Cool. Maybe brief intro. When folks are raising their hands, Jeff, should I answer these? How do we want to do this? If you're there.
Let's push all we'll do all the Q&A at the end. So if you're raising your hand, I'd encourage you to drop a question in Slido, and we will respond to those at the end.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much, Jeff. Cool. Okay. So tip 1, you know more than you think. Kind of the sub tip here is rely on the engineering practices that you know that have served you well over your career. And that is a very good sane default for making decisions. Cool. Okay. Tip 2, communicate in English. Asterisks. So this is also something we've seen amongst early startups, is when folks start talking about security, and more so when they start talking about compliance, they start communicating in like complianceese. They start communicating in legalese, right? So with English, and the asterisk here is English, or whatever language your company uses, like whatever is natural, right? And if they're, I don't know, planning their roadmap, they're like communicating in English. And then when they start talking about security or compliance, again, they like flip into like complicated words that no one quite understands. And you're talking about like the scope of your control system and its component parts and the infrastructure. And like, no one really knows what it's saying, and everyone's eyes sort of glaze over. And it's a sort of funny thing that I don't know how to actually explain why this happens, but it actually seems to happen pretty commonly. And so again, somewhat in the vein of tip 1, if you know more than you think. Tip 2 is just communicate in English. When you're talking about security, when you're talking about compliance, when you're talking about these things with your company or with your customers, you just want to be clear and communicate in words everyone understands, versus feeling like, hey, there's this separate lingo of like quasi SAT vocabulary, right? Where you need to talk about like the system and its boundaries. Good compliance phrase, which basically means your AWS footprint, to be clear, right? But you'll be talking to engineers, we talk about the system and its boundaries, and everyone's like, do I ask what that means? Do I not? Do I look dumb if I ask? And the answer is no, no one else understands. And so, step 1, if you can just say, AWS footprint, not that. Step 2, this is also true in talking to prospects and customers about your security. So in some cases, when you're selling to a larger company, and whether it's like a questionnaire, it's a written thing, or it's a phone call, someone will kind of ask you, and they might ask you about your system and its boundaries, or, about these kind of legalese sort of phrases. 1, there's nothing wrong with Googling these things. 2, honestly, I think it sometimes can be scary when you're talking to a prospect or a bigger company, and, you're like, how do I ask what those words mean without sounding dumb? I think you can do it, right? And I'm like, hey, just want to confirm what it is you're saying. Like when you say system and its boundaries, can you tell me what you mean, so that I make sure I answer your question well? And just don't be afraid to ask those questions. And in an elegant and respectful way, and you all can do that. But we've just seen a lot of startups that sort of get lost and again confused and anxious when like all these crazy words come up. And yeah, just one of the things we found over the last few years of Vanta is that all of these sort of impressive sounding words actually mean these like very normal concepts. And so there's this kind of obscurity around a lot of it. But if you can just push through when you're talking to your team, when you're talking to customers, you don't seem dumb. Everyone really appreciates it. So I would just encourage you all to do that too. And this also ties a bit into just like the overall Vanta ethos, and kind of our ethos as founders is just like take this mystifying thing that like seems overly confusing and try to demystify it. But y'all can do that too, and would encourage you to do so. That's tip 2. Cool. Tip 3, inculcate new team members. Okay, so another thing we found in like working with these, hundreds of startups over the last few years is those of them, there's this huge culture setting piece around setting up security and compliance at your company. And again, when people say culture setting, it means a lot of things. So to try to follow tip 2. By that, I just mean there's a bit of like, hey, is, our general security practices, things we care about at our company, a lot, a little, not at all. And when you bring on new team members, there is this like early period where you can, as you're onboarding them. And honestly, it's like a bit of you can manifest your future magic wand thing here. So you're onboarding them. You go to them and you say, hey, we're a company that cares about, the security of the customer data that we protect. Here's a few ways we do that. We make sure you all have 2-factor on your email and, cloud infrastructure and all the major tools. We, make sure we're following, 10 AWS cloud best practices that FISA tell us. 3, we, do something else. Cool, next step of the onboarding, right? And you go on. And even though that, takes you 45 seconds to say, and, maybe, I don't know, whatever, an hour or so to put into practice, there's actually like, now your new team member has walked away and being like, oh, I work at a company where this is important and we, do it in these ways. And every time I, hit the like 2-factor wall on AWS or on Gmail or whatever it is, I'm going to remember we're a company that does these things. Great. And they're just going to carry on. And they're going to think it's totally normal. And your company has always been one that does these things, whether or not that's true. And there's something that's kind of magic here. And I don't think I personally kind of appreciated like how magic this is until I was at Dropbox. And I was actually there when they started enforcing code review. Whereas like for the first many years, I won't tell you how many, but many years of Dropbox's existence, they kind of didn't do code review, and then it was sort of optional and unenforced. And then at some point they decided to enforce code review. At the time they had dozens legit engineers. And it was like basically a year-long change to actually enforce code review, right? Because you had like 100+ people who were like, we're a company that doesn't do code review. Code review will slow me down. This isn't what we do. We want to like move fast, and well, we don't really break things at Dropbox, but we want to move fast, right? And so it took this long time to get everyone on board with that change. And so you sort of watch that. And then Dropbox goes and continues hiring and hires another 100 engineers. And that second set of engineers comes into a company that does code review. And they're just like, cool, we're a company that does code review. I'll wait for someone to review my code. And right, and so that's what I mean about kind of the magic thing is you can take your early team members or new team members, tell them your practices, and then you are sort of just like manifesting that future, and they will think, again, they will think this is just the way the company works and it will be fine, and they will move on. And so when you're putting together the security practices or potentially some of the things you need to do for compliance for your company, this is like really where I think the rubber meets the road on the like start early advice, which Vanta does say. Honestly, somewhat self-interested, but also a bit of like, it is just easier to roll out new practices when you're smaller, fewer people on board. And so take that and, in your early days, just roll out the practices that you want, or you think you want for the company over the long term. And again, it's a little bit of a magic wand thing. It seems so simple and like, how is this actually magic? But it ends up being pretty cool. A little bit of a way to program people in a way they don't realize. Cool. Okay, so that's tip 3. Tip number 4, codify and code. Okay, so this is again, this is both an engineering best practices sort of thing, and actually really helpful for compliance. And so by this we generally mean using tools like Terraform or AWS CloudFormation, and just as much as possible putting configuration in code versus in button clicking in a console. And the kind of very compliancy reason for this is because compliance loves record keeping. Compliance loves a record of Christina wanted to make this change. Jeff looked at the change and thought it was good. Faisal rolled it out. That's 3 people who agreed to a change. So it's probably a better change than just if one person did it. And so for something like, say, changes in AWS, if you can run through that process in Terraform CloudFormation and code review, like you got it. Auditor comes in and is like, hey, did multiple people, review your infrastructure changes? And you're like, yep, here is, our GitHub for these Terraform files and the pull request. And it's just so much easier versus if you're clicking buttons and somebody comes in and it's like, hey, show me the record of changes in your infrastructure. And you're like, shoot, like, are there AWS audit logs for this? Probably, because there's AWS audit logs for everything. But like, how do you find those? And how do you show that, like, Christina clicked the button to like make a new S3 bucket, and then Jeff was sitting next to her and said it was cool, and like, how do you track that, right? So prior to things like Terraform or CloudFormation, the way people used to do that was through tickets. So it's like Christina makes a ticket to say, I want to make a new S3 bucket. Jeff looks at the ticket, approves it, writes it in a comment. Christina makes bucket and closes ticket, right? And everyone's like, I hate this. This is so much bookkeeping. Like, can I do actual work, right? And no one likes that. And so this is so that's the kind of the compliance reason to codify in code. Because again, if you're, using infrastructure as code tools, you're doing code reviews, you just have this whole record. So if somebody comes in and asks to see these records, you're like, here you go, got them all for you. Right. And then there's engineering reasons, of course, to use these tools too. And some of it's around like reliability and understanding what's done. You can look at this, text file and see the current state of where things are. You're not logging into a console, things aren't changing there, et cetera. You have this like source of truth. So when really early startups come to us and they say, hey, Vanta, I'm not ready to, devote money or devote time to what you all do, maybe someday, but what should I do now? Like 2 founders on a couch, what should I start doing? And honestly, one of the things we tell them that's kind of prescriptive, but I think actually helpful, it's one of the more prescriptive things we tell folks, is like use an infrastructure as code tool. It can be sort of painful in the beginning. They have their own quirks. It's like trial and error and like, software engineering, like, just bashing your head into a wall a little bit to get some of these things to work, honestly. But the initial setup pain versus like the long-term pain of, again, like infrastructure out of sync, between different environments, between different people, whatever, this whole audit burden. If you can just pay the initial tax of getting some of this set up, you will do much. You're probably gonna, amortize that over the long term and do much better and save a bunch of time later on. So it's just the codify in code as much as possible. Because this is an AWS event, talking a lot about cloud infrastructure. As I'm sure many of you, all of you know, you can use these tools for most things with an API. And so you can start codifying, non-cloud infrastructure settings in these files too. And it's sort of for the same reasons would recommend it. It can be difficult to set up. And so you just got to do that. How much do we want to, set this up now? Like our segment, pieces in or segment configuration and something like Terraform versus not. But the more you can sort of, again, pay that initial cost, the more I think you will reap benefits over time. Cool, so that's tip number 4. Tip 5, review code. Okay, so we sort of talked about this and I sort of made this assumption, but to the extent it's possible, if you can institute code review, maybe non-blocking, but code review in your company as early as possible, recommend it. Again, there's a bit of engineering best practice going on here. There's a bit of inculcating people and just being like, we're a company that code reviews. And so when you hire, people, they will just slot into the processes you've developed. With both of these. And then there's also the compliance piece, which similarly to the infrastructure as code tools, if you're ever going through one of these compliance audits, folks will ask you in compliance words, again, complicated words, show me a list of the changes to the application, right? Where they're like, can I see your pull requests?
what they're saying. And then, then you can, pull up the GitHub UI or Bitbucket UI or whatever it is you're using. And then they'll say, excellent. Please confirm to me that a second resource has confirmed all the changes before they were deployed, right? And in English, again, they're just saying, hey, did someone code review these? And if you can just show them that, then it's like, great, wonderful, moving on, next piece, thank you so much. Versus then trying to explain like, well, I deployed this change and no one saw it, but it's okay because it's not an important change, or right, then just trying to explain that to an auditor who probably doesn't understand certainly doesn't understand your business as well as you do. That tends to not be a fun exercise. Sometimes when we tell people code review, again, it's a little more prescriptive, and they'll be like, yo, we're two people, like, what do you want us to do? Or we're one engineer. Right. So if you're one engineer, like, yeah, you're not going to be reviewing code. Even though, at least when I program, sometimes it feels like, the me of, Tuesday and the me of Friday are like totally separate people. And, Friday me didn't know what Tuesday me was doing. Even then, you're not going to be able to do this at one person, questionably at two. At Vanta, we started non-blocking code review at 4, and then basically blocking a month later. So we gave everyone like a month of saying, hey, we're gonna, start, blocking pushes on this, or deploys, merges. And so we did it, relatively early. And again, I think when we were doing it, it was 2 founders and 2 employees. Those were our 4. And so there was also just a lot of like learning and training part of it too. And so that I think made it like easier to kind of roll out, right? Because it was like the new people, again, had been at Vanta for a week. We're still figuring out which way was up. And so appreciated the code review. And it wasn't as much of a, oh, you wrote TypeScript wrong code review. It was like, does this fit into the Vanta system code review, right? And then my co-founder and I were like, well, I'm actually not a proper software engineer. I've never studied CS. So I like love code review because I'll actually take all the you wrote TypeScript wrong feedback I can get. And so that was like a little bit of that. I think also for us, honestly, and I think this is much more common now, but like very much thought of software engineering like as a team sport, right? And by that I mean, this is like, how does your code fit into the system feedback? Like, does your naming make sense? Do these, architecture decisions make sense? Does your data modeling make sense? Those sort of things. And so when you sort of think of software engineering as a team sport, it's important that you understand your naming, you make reasonable data modeling choices, whatever. But it's actually way more important if like the other 3 people understand that stuff because they're going to have to use what you do. And it's only recently in Vanta's history, and we're 100 plus employees now, where we've actually started dividing up parts of the code base and the product to different engineering squads, we call them, but engineering like pods. Because previously it was just like everyone was touching everything, which is great in a lot of ways, but it makes software engineering a team sport, right? It means like, look, if I'm changing a data model over here and other people don't understand what I'm doing, and everything gets worse for them too. And so code review, there's, the compliance benefits, there's the security benefits of you just see what's going on, more eyes, makes bugs more shallow. And then there's also the team sport bits of hopefully y'all are making better decisions and you just understand what you're doing. And so when you're picking up someone else's data model, you can understand what the heck's going on. So would recommend this as early as possible, but understand it can be painful. Cool. Okay. Tip number 6, build audit trails. Okay, this probably makes a little bit more sense based on what I've said, especially about compliance audits, where again, the name of the game there is sort of just like writing down what happened somewhere. And you can write down what happened in, Jira tickets or whatever your ticketing system is, but that's just a lot of bookkeeping. It's a lot of work about work. And so as you're thinking about building your infrastructure and your product, to the extent you can build, and here audit doesn't mean compliance audit, just, logs of, this person did this thing at this timestamp, this change was made at this timestamp, somewhere in your product, not human legible, it's totally fine. But you just have these kind of like logs. This often ends up making things much easier from a compliance perspective, because again, when someone comes in and asks to see things, you're like, here's my gigantic log file. Like, what would you like to see? You sort of overwhelm them with data. Also helps from a security perspective, right? Because if you had, heaven forbid, had, a malicious actor come in and start doing things in your system, if, you're just like writing down all the actions that are taken, you at least have a list of all the things this malicious actor could have done. We don't know what they did, what someone else did, what a machine did, etc. But you at least have this list. And so it's not like malicious actor came in, the world was their oyster, who knows what happened. It's like malicious actor came in, here's all the things that happened in that time period. Maybe it's not a great list, but at least we have a list. So that ends up being important too. One other thing we're saying here, again, keeping in mind lesson 2 and communicating in English, is like, what does audit trail mean? And here it can mean sort of anything, right? So you can have, logs of all the actions that are taken in the product, taken by a user. This page was loaded, this button was clicked, this form was submitted, this request was made, whatever. You have them for your infrastructure, you can have them for your API. Like at Vanta, we have GraphQL API, like powers internal and external Vanta, all of that. And generally from the early days, we have tried to just write down like all the things that are happening, fling them into a log file. In the early days, these were just in AWS and they sort of just sat there. And now we run everything through Datadog. And again, some of the observability is helpful for, debugging, performance, like kind of the standard engineering things. And then there's also just the peace of mind of having these things. Again, if heaven forbid there is any sort of incident, sort of the first thing that happens when you would call up a incident response person and say, help me, they'd say, okay, did you write down what could have happened? And if not, like, okay, we're going to start with anything in the world could have happened. And so just encourage you to think about investing in this early. And again, also saying when I think about investing in it, the quotes there, because this doesn't have to be fancy. This doesn't have to be human readable. Definitely doesn't have to be a UI. It's just structured data that you can query over if you ever needed to. But it's not like, a human actually has to be able to read it. Script reading, it's just great. Cool. Okay, that's 6. Tip 7, centralized tools. Okay, so this is the standard. There are a quadrillion developer tools and infrastructure tools, and then just SaaS tools to run a company more broadly these days. This is great, truly. The world is all of our oysters in a good way in this case. There's all sorts of things we can do. I think there is a little bit of the design process, like flare out, figure out what sort of tools you like, your team likes, whether it's on the engineering front, again, kind of developer tooling, or just as a company, right? What tools are you using for product analytics? What tools are you using to email your users, your prospects, your whoever? It's great, like figure out what you want to use. And then as much as possible, try to centralize a bit. Like, does your sales team need to use a different emailing tool than your customer success team, than your support team? Probably not. At some point at Vanta, did those 3 teams use different emailing tools? For sure. Yeah. We are only now starting to be like, do we really need 3 of these? No. And it's not, I think sometimes it's phrased as a cost thing. Cost is real. I think at the earlier stages, the $50 a month SaaS subscription isn't going to be the make or break for your company. Probably, especially if you're venture backed. I think where the centralization really helps is around keeping track of customer data and all the places it could be. Early on in the sort of ideation, before we started coding phase of Vanta, we were just validating the idea. Talked to a security person who's at Uber at the time, is now at Facebook, is now an angel investor in Vanta, and he's a very, decade and a half of security engineering teams. And we were talking about a lot of this, and he was like, look, customer data is basically nuclear waste. It seeps into everything. It goes to all these little nooks and crannies and you can never get it out, right? And so you're constantly like cleaning it up and doing your best, but it's radioactive and it's just seeping into everything else. It's a very dramatic analogy, but I think it's actually kind of effective too. And this is true, especially when it comes to third-party tools, right? So like vendors you're using, your email tool, your product analytics tool, your build pipeline, your whatever. Because one of the things we've seen over the last like 4 or 5 years is that, like, let's say your build pipeline tool gets breached. And so a bunch of the data your company put into the build pipeline tool is out, leaked. And by the way, you put customer data into the build pipeline tool. Well, now it looks like you got breached and you have to turn around and email your users and say, hey, I know you trusted us with that data. We trusted this other company with that. They got breached, so now your data's out. But please continue to trust us. Can you renew your subscription next month? Right? And just like no one, I'm joking, but I'm not, like no one wants to send those emails. No one likes those things. No one wants that to happen. It doesn't happen every day. I don't mean to scare you, but just what actually happens is, this is where it's just helpful to have kind of fewer tools that just kind of like lowers the risk and the likelihood, and then the risk, kind of minimizes the attack surface there. And so if you can, I would, again, let you and your team like experiment, figure out what tools you want. There's a quadrillion out there. That is great, truly. And then as you start to figure out what you like and don't, start to centralize a bit more. Also, hopefully that helps, kind of other administrative things at your company be slightly easier. You're not paying for 4 different email tools, you're not managing those subscriptions, whatever. But honestly, I think some of those are secondary benefits, and the primary one is just the like customer data as nuclear waste, the framing there, which again is aggressive, but also I think just helpful. Cool. Okay, so that's tip 7. Tip number 8, prompt the conversation. Okay, so this is actually getting and speaking to when you are selling your product. So here at this point, I'm going to assume you've made a great product. You have intuition that people want it. You're starting to have conversations with people about using it and then charging it. And part of using it is probably them starting to put data in your tool. They're starting to charge for your tool. And I think, again, in talking to founders, one thing we see is, one, like getting to that point, congratulations, tremendous amount of work. 2, pretty exciting to get to that point. And then 3, back to the beginning, there's a bunch of trepidation about bringing up security, right? Especially when you're selling to someone who is bigger than you are. And when you're a small startup, almost definitionally, everyone is bigger than you are. And so there's a lot of like, ooh, maybe if I don't talk about security or compliance, they won't bring it up and I can like skate through. And like, yeah, I just don't want to bring it up because I don't know what they'll ask me, and they might ask me a bunch of stuff I don't know, or I don't understand the words, and then I'll look dumb and like, just, hope they don't bring it up. And sometimes this works, truly. But I think in more cases than not, especially these days, and especially because of that, vendor risk thing from tip 7, more and more of your software buyers are probably going to ask you about your company's security or your company's compliance, especially if you're taking on a bunch of their customer data or data that kind of makes them anxious. And so in those cases, we've actually found, even though it is scary and a little unnatural, very much trying to coach startup founders into prompting security and compliance conversations with their buyers. And almost at the very beginning saying, hey, really glad you're excited to use my tool. I'm super excited to work with you. Given that we're email app for, support teams, right? We end up getting a bunch of customer data from our customers, right? We get email addresses, we get, details about support configuration, and understandably, customers have questions about, our startup security. So here's what we do, blah, 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 blah. And then you can just, say what you do. I'm going to talk through what that is. But actually prompting the conversation in that way, 1, makes you look like you're totally on top of things. Like you know enough to know it's a concern, you've read their mind, you like understand what a big company enterprise buyer wants. You're not some dinky like fly-by-night startup, right? 2, you also sort of set the table with like, hey, and here I'm going to tell you about my security. Also this poll, so you should all vote in right now. Cool. 2, you get to start to talk about some of these things, and you get to sit and sort of set the table and say, hey, I'm going to tell you some stuff that then they will respond to. But again, you get to sort of shape the narrative and start the conversation there. And so again, even though it's unnatural and maybe a little scary at first, we've actually really found it effective for founders or salespeople or whoever's selling to like bring up security early in these sorts of things. Okay, that's tip 8. Cool. Okay, tip 9. Do the dance. Okay, so this is again continuing on that as you're continuing to sell your product, and people ask you for security or compliance in some way. They might ask you, just tell me about your company's security. They might say, hey, do you have a SOC 2 ISO alphabet soup certification? They might say, hey, can you fill out this questionnaire for me? They might ask this, and I think it can be, it's just kind of a separate parallel world to some of this and maybe a little intimidating, but also just want to say that this stuff is all not rocket science. When you get these things, it's really easy to Google and be like, what is a SOC 2? And go Google that, and you can figure out what that is. And it ends up being really hard to avoid a lot of these things. So I think more so 2, 4, 6 years ago, someone could say, hey, are you pen tested annually? And you'd be like, nope, but we look forward to doing that in the future. And the person would say, oh, yes, okay, sounds good. You're a small startup. What do I expect? Now that conversation is, sort of, oh, you're not pen tested? Well, I can't buy your product until you are. So let me know when you are. And so this is just a part of the thesis of Vanta was this stuff would become more inevitable. And just over the last years, it has become that. And there is good and bad of that. But it has just ended up being much more inevitable and much more of something that companies do need to engage in, and just figure out a way to engage in a way that works for them. Cool. Okay. So these are the 9 tips that we just went through. 1, you know more than you think. 2, communicate in English or your language, not in compliance speak, and you don't have to learn to speak compliance speak. No one wants to speak it. 3, inculcate new team members. Like, figure out your practices and just tell your new team members it's what your company does, and you will go forth and like manifesting the future you want. 4, codify in code. So an infrastructure as code tool as much as possible. Some setup cost, admittedly, but honestly, you can amortize that, and it really pays off in time savings and auditability down the line. 5, making up numbers here. 5, code review as early as it feels all right to do for your company. Vanta, we did this at 4 people, 4 engineers. 6, building audit trails, machine readable lists of all the things that happened. Don't have to be human readable, just something you can parse through if you ever needed to. 7, centralizing the tools, infrastructure developer tools, SaaS tools across your company. Like, go forth, experiment with all sorts of things. And then if you can sort of figure out and centralize a bit more, probably for the best. 8, when you're selling your product, as unnatural as it might feel, try to prompt security conversations. Ask your buyer, your champion, what security review looks like for them, so that you can go through it and honestly look like you're a pro at this. You do this all the time. You just, security review is second nature to you, whether or not that is accurate today. And then 9, do the dance. So part of this security review compliance piece is just inevitable in B2B software sales today. There's good and bad of that, but it's really hard to get around one way or the other. And those are my 9 starting up security tips. And I hope there's lots of questions. There's at least lots in the chat. So I'm going to open that up. And maybe also Jeff and Faisal, turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Christina. Phenomenal session. Great practical tips. And I love the analogies. So the way we have a lot of really good questions in Q&A. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. We will get to as many as we can. And then Faisal has actually committed that he will respond in writing to anything that we can't get to today during the session. So he'll spend the next couple of days also responding, but we're going to get to as many as we can. Faisal's going to moderate this portion. So he'll toss questions to Christina, maybe chime in himself. I'm going to drop the feedback link as they're going. Please tell us, share your feedback for the session. And with that, turn it to you, Faisal. Here is the Slido link for anyone who wants to make sure you're following along.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Christina. Amazing talk. Great point. So I think we have 10 minutes. We can go through all the questions, but maybe we'll go through some of the top voted, and then I do see some sort of trends and patterns in the question. I think we'll be interested to hear your thoughts on those. But the first question is the top voted one. I'm building a B2C app where users are uploading files. So user uploaded content. What kind of security audits, certificates, policies that we need to take care of?
Yeah. Okay. So honestly, the answer to a lot of these is it depends on what your customers want. And so, yeah, broadly, when people are like, I'm building a blah 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 app, sometimes you can tell them. For B2C, okay, so if your customers, your paying customers are consumers, I would let them be your guide. If they're asking you for compliance certifications and saying, hey, I'm not going to use your product or buy your product unless you become ABC compliant, then I would think about becoming ABC compliant. My guess, you should ask them, don't trust me, is your end consumers will not ask you to become ABC compliant, whatever it is. And so for B2C, I would focus on growing your user base, building what they want. They ask you for a compliance certification, then go investigate it. Broad answer there. But again, ask them, trust them, don't trust me. Second bit is if you are operating in Europe or if European data, there's privacy regulations, GDPR primarily. And so that's actually the one caveat is, yeah, your users may or may not ask you for privacy regulation, but say if they're in Europe, you do have to think through those things too.
Yeah, I'll just echo what you said, and it's going to depend on, what kind of data are you storing? Is there PII, PHI data there? And that will sort of guide you just from being able to offer your service, what kind of compliance you would need for that particular thing. So Christina, I think other trend is a lot of questions around GDPR, data residency, those type of things. So maybe if you can touch on how, just at a high level, you think about GDPR, CCPA, and other relevant, those kind of like government regulations around the globe that they're seeing, and how that impacts startups building fast.
Yeah, I mean, inevitabilities for good and bad, right? The good of it is I think these regulations are well-intentioned around data privacy and pushes at least the conversation and forces companies to think through it. The bad is I actually kind of do believe there are taxes on small companies more than large ones. I mean, there are taxes on everyone, but the big companies are just more able to pay the tax on the small company. So it's increasingly something that you can't ignore. Lots of startups do in the early days. So it's not advice, it's definitely not legal advice. But I think a lot of startup founders in the early days are like, look, I can, again, give our Dropbox paper story. I can become GDPR compliant, and then I can see if I have product market fit. But if I don't have product market fit, I'm not going to have users, and the GDPR compliance won't matter. Or I can try to find product market fit, get users, make sure I, am following data privacy regulations. So you can choose which path you want to pursue in that. But I think it is, if you have something that users are using, especially, in Europe and California, which sort of means on the internet, this is something to keep an eye to. There are an increasing number of, companies that will help you with this. Off the record, off the recording, Vanta is going to offer something here quite quick, like shortly, in a matter of weeks. But like lots of people will do this for you. You can DIY it. sort of like a lot of the compliance stuff is you can pay someone to help you with it, or you can, again, it's a lot of like SAT words, and you can go Google and figure out how to do it yourself. And it's not rocket science. It's just a bunch of steps to follow.
Awesome. Yeah, so then next one, I think there were a lot of questions around HIPAA or HIPAA compliance. So maybe I know Vanta does have a service and for HIPAA. By the way, I wanted to just highlight my experience with Vanta real quick. So I do these CTO office hours with many of my startups. I'm based in New York, so I support our East Coast startups. And Vanta has come up again and again. Any of my sort of fastest growing startups are using Vanta to really accelerate their compliance journey. But Christina, back to you, like maybe share like how do you see the HIPAA compliance and some guidance or thoughts on it?
Yeah, so really broadly, HIPAA is actually like part of a US law, and it roughly says, hey, if you have patient health information, just sort of broadly defined stuff about people's health, you cannot leak it on the internet. I'm being really, really reductive here. And if you do, there's just tremendous fines, like in the like tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient record. So please don't do that. And so if you're operating in the US with healthcare information, ends up being something traditionally startups have thought about this. If they're healthcare startups, totally makes sense. One thing we've seen that's been interesting and surprising to me is actually a lot of the folks using Vanta for HIPAA compliance are not healthcare. The healthcare companies got started earlier. It's a new product for us. Zendesk is not a customer, but there's sort of my canonical HIPAA example here, where like Zendesk is a text box that people put information in on the internet. And Zendesk can say, hey, please don't put patient health information in our text box. And people will still put patient health information in the text box. And so Zendesk had to go get HIPAA compliance because they were like, well, people are putting it in, even though we tell them not to. And that mitigates our liability a little bit, but honestly, the US government doesn't care. So Zendesk had to go get HIPAA compliance. Didn't do it with Vanta, I don't mean to claim they did, but that was actually like, we see a lot of startups like that are, again, not targeted at healthcare at all, or targeted much more generally, but sort of as they grow, end up being in line of fire of this health information. And so having to go and try to protect that in various ways. And then the HIPAA piece is just, putting the correct steps in place there.
Awesome. One thing that I wanted to touch on, Rohit had a question around, building for a global audience and many sort of requirements around data storage, residency and segregation. I think that's where cloud comes into the picture. You should really, from AWS perspective, right? We have these global infrastructure around the globe, right? So regions, availability zones, and you can really put fine-grained guardrails around your infrastructure to control how data is moving from one to the other. So I think there's a lot more discussion to be had around that, but I think cloud has made that that a lot easier in some ways to at least track and control. And prior to that, imagine having to go to each country where your users are and having to procure infrastructure. I don't know, Christian, if you have any more thoughts on that.
No, that's great. We see a lot of folks surprising us again, like multi-region early on. And I think it's actually especially the European startups, like at the European US thing, but yeah.
Maybe we can take one that I think was interesting. I think there's also like other questions that kind of are on the same track. What is the tipping point for a startup when you go from build to start thinking about security?
Yeah.
Other questions that kind of get into that same sort of idea. Like, when do you start thinking about security?
Yeah. Okay. So on the security front, again, if you can start thinking about it as early as possible, and maybe you just define security as engineering best practices, but try to do that stuff from early on. I also saw a few questions on when should I start thinking about compliance. And I think my answer here is like when that is the feature your customers want, right? And so when your customers are coming to you and being like, I won't use your product till you build blah, blah, blah feature, like build that feature for them, or if you think it's a good thing, right? But when they're coming and saying, hey, I won't use you until you prove to me you're secure, you prove to me you're SOC 2 compliant, then that becomes the feature you work on. Cool. Yeah. but let your customers be your guide.
So I think that's great. I know we're time here, so I want to respect everyone's time. Jeff shared the feedback link. Please give us feedback. And Jeff, back to you. You want any closing notes, and Christian as well?
Yeah, just thanks everyone for joining, and a big thank you to Christina. You have a lot to juggle and manage right now, so we really appreciate you making time to present to this audience. And thanks Faisal as well. Thank you all for making time. We'll see you next week. I will share the recording in the next 24 hours. And then Christina, are you comfortable with us sharing the slides?
Yeah, I can send you slides.
Perfect.
My email's in the chat. Totally.
Great. Yeah, there are lots of requests for those in the chat. Yep. So we'll share the recording, the slides. Tell us what you thought, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for having me. Good luck.